Hello everyone. My presentation is titled Armenian Food Culture Under the USSR, From Collectivization to Cold War Shortages. I chose Armenia because it's often an overlooked country in global history. Despite its small size, Armenia's food culture tells a fascinating story of resilience. Through collectivization, food shortages, and Cold War politics, Armenians managed not only to survive, but to persevere their culinary traditions as a way of holding on to their identity throughout their trials and tribulations under Soviet occupation. A little bit of a history lesson before we jump into the thick of things. Armenia's history stretches back more than 2,000 years, with a culture rooted in Christianity, winemaking, and strong family traditions. But for over 1,300 of those years, it was ruled by foreign powers, from the Arabs to the Ottomans to the Russians, and later the Soviets. In 1922, Armenia was incorporated into the Soviet Union. This meant political control from Moscow, but also dramatic shifts in how Armenians lived and ate. Soviet collectivization, which I'll explain in a moment, took away family farms and placed food production under the state. Later, Cold War competition drained resources into the military instead of agriculture. I chose Armenia specifically because it represents the experience of a smaller republic. Unlike Russia or Ukraine, Armenia didn't have vast fields of food reserves. That means Soviet food policies had an especially strong impact on everyday life here in the small republic in the South Caucasus. Which leads me to the geography and climate. Geography always shapes cuisine. Armenia is a landlocked, mountainous country in the Caucasus. It has fertile valleys, but it also has long, cold winters and hot summers. This continental climate encouraged the cultivation of grapes, apricots, and grains. As a matter of fact, the apricot is Armenia's national fruit. Armenia is considered one of the world's oldest wine-making regions. Archaeologists discovered a 6,000-year-old winery in the Areni cave, which shows how deeply food and drink are tied to Armenian identity. Because the winters were harsh, Armenians developed preservation methods like pickling, fermenting, and drying. And because mountain villages were often isolated, cuisine developed a strong regional variation. All of these laid the foundations for Armenian cuisine before the Soviet Union, but soon that foundation would be challenged. Before Soviet rule, Armenian food was rich, varied, and tied to tradition. Here are a few key examples. On the left, we see the dolma, which are grape leaves stuffed with rice, herbs, and occasionally meat. Each roll was carefully wrapped, symbolizing the unity of family. Second from the left, we have the lavish, thin flatbread baked in a clay tonneer oven. Lavish is more than food, it's sacred. It's used at weddings, blessings, and funerals. UNESCO recognized it as an intangible heritage in 2014. Next, we have korovats. They're skewered meats grilled over open coals, celebrating the centerpiece of celebration and hospitality. Basically, they are Armenian versions of kebabs. Even today, no Armenian party is complete without korovats. Harise, last on the right. A porridge of cracked wheat and chicken or lamb, which symbolizes survival. It was cooked slowly in times of famine and sieges, shared by whole communities as a sign of endurance. These foods weren't just meals, they were memory, ritual, and identity, all of which would be tested during the Soviet years. When Armenia entered the Soviet Union in 1922, one of the first major challenges was collectivization. Private farms were abolished and replaced with collective farms called kolkhozes. Apologies for the pronunciation. Families lost not just their land, but their independence to grow what they wanted. Quotas were imposed, requiring much of the harvest to be shipped to the state. That often meant food was exported to Moscow while locals went hungry. This occurred not only in Armenia, but all across the USSR, especially in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. This policy drained regional diversity. Instead of farming or for local needs, Armenians were forced into standardized farming for the Soviet system. Food shortages and famines followed, especially during the 1930s, during the Holodomor, where millions of people across the Soviet Union passed away from famine. Collectivization was not just about farming. It was about control over what people grew, what they ate, and ultimately how they lived. And this had a huge impact on Armenian culture. relying heavily on growing their own goods for thousands and thousands of years. The Soviet Union also wanted to reshape how people ate. Leaders promoted a standardized Soviet cuisine that was the same across all republics. Urbanization played a major role. As Armenians moved to cities, they became more reliant on grocery stores and cafeterias instead of traditional village farming. Meat and vegetables were often canned, a major shift from fresh, seasonal cooking. Cafeterias served mass-produced meals like cutlets, porridges, soups, and salads. Dishes like the Olivier salad, which we see on the right, a potato and mayonnaise-based salad, became staples of Soviet celebrations. Even borscht, originally Ukrainian, became mainstream across the USSR, including Armenia. This doesn't mean Armenians abandoned their food entirely, but Soviet cuisine began to mix with Armenian traditions, creating a hybrid that reflected both local culture and state control. As the Cold War intensified, food scarcity became even more severe. Collectivization had already weakened agriculture, but now the Soviet Union poured its resources into the arms race while it was competing against the United States. As a result of this, only about 4% of state investment went to agriculture. Armenians faced the consequences directly. Harsh summers and cold winters damaged harvests. Imports were restricted by Cold War trade limits. Families spent hours in bread lines waiting for essentials like bread, sugar, or meat. Grocery stores were often empty. At the same time, propaganda posters claimed abundance, showing baskets of fruit and grains. The reality was quite the opposite. For many, the contrast between propaganda and lived experience was a daily frustration, experienced not only by Armenians, but all Soviet citizens across the nation. But even in those difficult times, Armenians held on to tradition. Food became a quiet form of resistance. Lavish, as I mentioned earlier, continued to be baked in homes passed down throughout generations. Dolma remained a staple of family gatherings. Holiday foods, especially Easter dishes, were made in secret. One example is gata, a sweet pastry often eaten at Easter. Families baked it quietly, even when religion was heavily discouraged and censored by the state. Gardening and food preservation also became essential. Families grew their own vegetables, foraged, and made preserves, not only to survive, but to maintain their independence, their cultural independence from Moscow. In this way, food was more than just survival, it was cultural resilience. By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union began to stagnate and was soon collapsing. Stagnation meant even greater shortages. For example, in 1984, food production fell by 14% compared to the year prior. During this time period, black markets became rampant, as families bought or traded food outside official stores. For Armenians, this underground economy was often the only way to get better quality food from the poor farms or the poor grocery stores that were giving away terrible food quality. The 1988 Spatak earthquake in Armenia made things much worse. Thousands were left homeless and food shortages grew more severe. Soviet aid was slow and inadequate, highlighting just how broken the system had become. By the time the USSR collapsed in 1991, Armenia had endured decades of shortages but still preserved their traditions. In 1991, Armenia had finally gained their long sought-after independence. This was both a challenge and an opportunity. The economy struggled being independent from Moscow, but cultural pride flourished. Armenian cuisine, once suppressed, returned to the forefront. Restaurants and families alike revived traditional recipes and even celebrated them openly. A major milestone came in 2014 when lavish was recognized by UNESCO as a part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. It wasn't just about bread. It was about acknowledging Armenian endurance. What was once baked quietly in homes during the Soviet era became a celebrated symbol of national identity. To conclude, Soviet rule reshaped Armenian food culture in two key phases. First, collectivization in the 20s and 30s stripped diversity and tied food to the state. Secondly, Cold War shortages deepened the crisis, leaving families to rely on gardens, black markets, and their own creativity. But through it all, Armenian traditions endured. lavash, dolma, korovats, harissa, and Easter foods such as gata all became symbols of resilience. Food in Armenia was never just food. It was a memory, identity, and quiet resistance. And it remains so today, showing us the power of culture to survive even under political oppression. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.